4 to 5 years. And so then I graduated from that program in 2019, and then came here to USI later that same year. And I think, sometimes I think back and I think maybe if I had had more guidance or people that could have like mentored me through that process of graduate school, maybe I would have had a smoother trajectory or had been able to kind of, hone my interests, because I feel like in some ways I do so many different things and have all these interdisciplinary interests. But I think ultimately it keeps things exciting, and I have all these different things that I'm able to do and that I enjoy doing. So yeah, that's a little bit how I ended up where I'm at now.
Laura, you're muted.
Always. Sure. So I'll be relatively quick. I was an English major. I was also a physics major in college. Eventually realized I cared about English much more and was coincidentally better at it. So in my senior year, I had been involved in some undergraduate research, knew it was something I really loved, and got some help with applying to graduate programs. I did end up going straight from undergraduate. Sorry about my throat. I'm getting over a little bit of a bug. Going straight from undergraduate to graduate school. And that's motivated in large part that I was going to be graduating in the wake of a pretty big recession. And so looking at grad school stipends was a lot less terrifying than it normally was, because it wasn't that much less money than I would have been making in some other jobs. And so my path to grad school was that put out applications. I was applying for PhD programs that would let you get a master's along the way. So a master's as in an MA. And that's partly because I was pretty confident that what I wanted to do was research and teach and sort of go into the profession of English literature. And you, in large part, need a PhD for that these days. In literature specifically, creative writing is different. And it was a way to get my master's paid for, as opposed to a lot of master's programs are pretty tuition heavy. If you get a master's on the way to a PhD program, the school sees it as more of an investment, and there are different financial options at that point. So I got my PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, which is in Philadelphia. Got that in 2016. Had a couple of temporary visiting professorships, and then landed at USI. And that's my story.
And the rest is history. So actually, I was going to go from this to elements of the application, but I actually think maybe we'll talk about funding next, because in case some of you are like, I don't care what the elements of the application are, if I don't understand, if I'm going to have to go into debt for this. And because Kristen and Laura got into it a little bit, and I know that Dr. Pitcher has the same advice for an MFA. So an MFA is what's sort of called the studio degree, where you're working on your craft. The degree itself opens some doors, but it's not like you have the degree and you can get like a teaching job like UCS have. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And so my advice is always to look at the funded programs, because many of them are, they give you what is called a stipend for a teaching assistantship. So like Alice, I also taught composition, and at Purdue I also got to teach creative writing as part of my master's program, and for that I received tuition remission, so I didn't have to pay tuition, and I got a small but totally workable stipend. And like Laura said, I was after I graduated from college, I lived in Portland. I just kind of hung out for 2 years. I worked at a natural foods co-op. I did an internship, did some cool stuff. But it, for me, it was like I had absolutely nothing to lose by going to get an MFA. If I didn't go into debt and they were going to pay me to be there, I can only kind of come out ahead. And not all programs are funded. Some fancy ones like Columbia, whose application fee is also sort of astronomical. They really like not welcoming, but a lot. And I think it would even be most of the programs have this option of the teaching assistantship. And it's quite competitive to get into one of these programs. It's not like an open door, but it's very possible to do that. And we've had students from USI be accepted into funded MFA programs. And do I want to add anything about, the other thing that I know, there are sometimes other opportunities for funding as well, like at my school, if you were the editor of the literary magazine, you got additional money. There was like a program director's assistant position, and someone who managed the reading series. So there are also these opportunities in addition to teaching that would give you more money and also give you these kinds of experiences that then you can parlay into a job and put on your CV or put on your resume. So the reason to get an MFA is if you really want to work on your writing and you want to have a book manuscript and you want to have that time. And then the other sort of way to think about it is that just like an English degree, whatever sort of like career path you want to take, you really have to figure out how to sell yourself and your skills. So you can go the route that we all went and look into teaching in academia. That is increasingly challenging because universities are less and less funded, and so there are less and less jobs, fewer and fewer jobs. But there are also a lot of other opportunities. So people I know who have their MFA have done just a huge range of things. Keen is a video game writer, so he writes like narratives for esports players. Like he's like an esports, so he's like the Cinderella story of this person who's playing League of Legends or whatever. I like basically don't understand, but that's something that he does. I've had a lot of friends going to grant writing, nonprofit work. I'm using those writing skills. A friend of mine is designing artificial intelligence personalities in Silicon Valley, with an MFA in poetry. So one of the pieces of advice that I would give as if you're thinking about an MFA seriously is to look at what kind of other opportunities that program offers you in addition to writing and workshop, and thinking about like, well, what kinds of jobs would I be interested in doing, and how might these sort of things help me get there. So you don't have to. I think if you only know people with graduate degrees who teach because you interact with them in college, that's not the only career path for this particular degree. Yeah, we'll do the same. We'll hop over to Alice and then.
Oh, I was going to add just a couple of
Casey.
small things to that. Just that in addition to the stipend, usually you get insurance. So it's not great insurance, but it's insurance. It's better. I mean, it's actually probably as good or better than what you would get, and way cheaper than what you would get on your own. There's often competitive fellowships too, where people don't have to teach at all. They just get funded to write. And just to kind of echo what Rosa said at the beginning, and if you've had me in class, you've heard me say this before, but and I'm only speaking about the MFA in particular here. The MFA, the only thing you're sacrificing, as Rosalie said, well, it is a privilege to be able to get it. Not everybody can do this, but if you are privileged enough to do it, the only thing you really have to lose is that it takes 2 to 3 years off of your lifetime earnings. That's really, it just delays you starting your life, your career. Now that, that's really it. And it's, I always tell students, it's about what you can get out of the program, not what the program is going to give you, because you're going to have a degree and that's great. It's a terminal degree. You'll likely have some teaching experience. You'll meet lots of cool people. You'll have a book length manuscript. It's kind of up to you for how successful that manuscript is, but you'll have all of these things and that's great. But, as Rosalie said, it's not a ticket for anything. You have to do for an MFA, again, only the MFA, you've got to do it because you believe in taking 2 or 3 years to work on an art with no expectation except I'm going to put everything I've got into this for 2 to 3 years and see what happens at the end, but not thinking like, it's not a very smart career move. It's an artistic degree, right? And that's if you go, as long as you go into it with that in mind, I think it will be an incredibly fruitful experience. But if you go into it expecting to have something, like a job waiting for you, or, oh, I'm going to have an agent when I'm done, and I'm going to, it's like maybe, but maybe not. But you will leave the program a better writer than you went in, for sure. So.
Alice, you want to hop on there?
Yeah, sure. I think going off of what Dr. Pitcher said, the industry could change so much in the next 10 years. So I think something students need to realize is that the decision you make now, you might change your mind later on, and perhaps that's a good thing, perhaps that's a bad thing, but it's always important to consider expecting the unexpected, I suppose, that the market could change, the industry could change, your interests may change. And that's kind of my path a little bit, because I graduated from undergrad and went straight into my MFA program, kind of just thinking that was the next step, without so much exploring or without too much guidance. But I did just want to bring up a couple of other options in case you want that kind of gap year. Like I've had friends who took a year off to teach abroad, the Teach for America program. One of my close friends went to Taiwan to teach, and he never came back. Like he's still living there after 15 years, and he loves it. As Rosalie mentioned, some of the MFA leading to other career tracks. You mentioned a video game designer, something that I'm working on right now with my voice work, because my degree is in playwriting and I have experience with performance and theater directing. I'm doing audiobook narration, which I discovered during the pandemic. And it's acting, but remote, and it's kind of interesting. And for some of you who might be good readers, we kind of forget reading as a skill because we're so focused on writing all the time. But I feel like nowadays audiobooks is a really powerful industry, but also an accessibility resource. So for me, it's kind of thinking about how I can use my voice, or how I can use my former acting skills to convey a story. And that's freelance work that I kind of draw on my storytelling theory and craft from my MFA to power performances. So I feel like that's kind of another option, and it also goes into like voiceover work for video game characters, and commercial voiceover. So not quite my writing, but it's still part of this whole storytelling. So there's just a lot of options.
Mm-hmm. I also was thinking about like, okay, what are the careers that I know people with MFAs have done? I'll also add like advertising for poets is one. Like you have that concision, you have that attention to language. And so that's been like a surprising thing. I think I've known several people who have degrees in poetry that do that. Kristen, if you want to add anything about funding and job opportunities.
I would definitely echo what has been said in terms of, if you're planning to go to graduate school, it's always a good idea to try to find funded opportunities. And I didn't even know that was an option when I was applying for my master's program, because I really liked the school that I was at and I loved my program, and they had an MA program, and it was an in-person program, but I thought I'll just do that. But it was not funded until your second year, which is not typical. I don't even know if they use that model anymore, but it was they wanted you to have 1 year of graduate experience under your belt before you started teaching for them. And so I covered all of that first year through student loans, which then of course I had to pay off later, which is not, that's not an optimal situation because there are funded programs out there. But I didn't even know it was an option. Like I said, I really didn't have people telling me that these were options, like these kinds of opportunities, like what we're doing today. And I also just didn't ask any questions, right? And so I think if I could go back, I think it would have been nice to try to seek out opportunities to have my master's degree funded, right? And so I would always suggest doing that. And of course, as Professor Moffat said, those are more competitive opportunities, which is okay. That doesn't mean that, you can't do that or you shouldn't pursue those opportunities. You absolutely should. It just means that maybe you're applying to more places and you kind of apply to programs that are like, at different levels in terms of like, you have your dream programs that would be like the greatest thing ever if you got into it, but also programs that, you would still enjoy going to, but maybe aren't completely at the top of your list. But, and so I am grateful that second year that I did have that opportunity to do some teaching and get some funding that way. And then having had that experience in my master's program, I knew then when I started applying for PhD programs that I wasn't going to go. Well, and I think in general, and Dr. Soderberg can correct me or Dr. Pitcher if this is wrong, but I think for the most part, PhD programs don't accept people unless they're offered funding, right? And so, so that is kind of the nice thing about going into a PhD program is really you won't get in unless they're also offering you a funding package. And so in my PhD program, it was a great funding package, although we were not offered insurance. Dr. Soderberg, did you have insurance through your program? Maybe I just missed out.
We had medical, we did not have dental or vision because teeth and eyes don't count.
Okay. Okay, yeah, that's wild. I did not have any offer of insurance, or maybe I did and I just did not take advantage of that. I can't remember now, but it seems to me that there was not an insurance situation. But luckily, I was married to someone who had a job with insurance, but only just for a little bit because then that situation changed. But there were still opportunities for us to get insurance. It just wasn't through my program in particular. But the funding package was decent. So I received tuition remission and then a stipend on top of that to do a variety of different assistantships. For the first couple years, I mostly did teaching, but then for my last part of the program, I did a lot of web design work because they found out that I could do that kind of thing and they didn't have anybody to do it and sort of created this position for me, which was really great. And now it's been a while since I've done that kind of thing and I've probably forgotten a lot of it, but it was really nice when I was doing the program because teaching takes up a lot of time of, it's great experience, but it can be a lot of prep work and a lot of grading. And so doing that additional assistantship instead of teaching, since I already had that teaching experience, really gave me the opportunity to do some other cool things that I could put on my resume and not have to spend so much time grading and all of those things. But in terms of job opportunities, I think, so people that I graduated with in my cohort and who have graduated in recent cohorts from the program that I went to, some of them that we are, again, our doctoral degree is in rhetoric and writing studies. Several of them became technical writers. And a few of them work in like higher education online course design. Several of us are professors and teach courses in professional writing and rhetoric at the university level. I know a couple of them teach at high schools. Really, teaching isn't the only opportunity, especially with rhetoric and writing studies. There are opportunities to do other types of writing and professional and technical communication in those jobs. There are many of them. That field is growing and they tend to pay very well. So if you're interested in that type of writing, those are some great career options that you can do with this particular degree.
Laura, let's hop over to you.
Sure. So just to address funding quickly, for PhD programs, I completely agree that most programs will not let you in unless you're fully funded. That is because they're trying not to create nightmare situations. You do not want to be going into debt for a humanities PhD or a PhD more broadly. It's not that kind of degree. I think the exception is something like James Franco didn't get funding for his Yale PhD. But as long as you're not independently wealthy or famous, you're probably not getting in without money. But always, if you're in the situation of looking at graduate programs and thinking about whether things make sense, look for how transparent the program is about their funding. The ideal scenario is a program that puts a number on a website and says, this is what we expect our students to get paid. That also tells you that they create relatively equal funding situations across their student body, which is also what you want because PhD cohorts are quite small. And so if you've got a group of 6 to 7 students, you don't want a situation where somebody's getting twice the money as somebody else, or they're competing for a pool of resources. You want a program that's interested in leveling that a little bit. My sense of PhD funding is that the stipends that they provide are really flexible about what cost of living means, so that in low cost of living places, especially public universities, a PhD stipend could go, I think 8 to 10K might be the low end. Correct me if that feels wrong. I think sort of public schools tend to have lower stipends because there tend to be more teaching opportunities to let you make money on top of that. So private schools tend to have fewer teaching opportunities, but their baseline stipends tend to be a bit higher because they have endowments and a little bit more cash to throw around. Sort of at the high end of stipends would be private schools in New York. Their funding might be up to 30K a year. I'd need to check how inflation has adjusted for costs. Sort of high 20s is the high end for when I was there, for when I was going through grad school. I was not getting high 20s for the record, but that's sort of the bandwidth for PhD programs. Once you do that digging, you'll get a sense of what different schools are offering. It also makes sense to say, all right, what are the work requirements around this? How much teaching will I need to do to make this money? So for me, for instance, I think I had 1 year that was required teaching to get the money, and then like maybe I had 2 years fully funded without teaching, and then a couple years with teaching. It's that kind of calculus you want to pay attention to because it really changes how quickly you can get through the degree. And I will also say, if you're getting through applications and you're at the point of looking at big fancy schools, don't be scared of names. Think about whether the school is a good fit for you and don't disqualify yourself in the process. Some schools do have application fees, and those are a nightmare, and I wish they wouldn't have them. But often they'll also have options that say, hey, look, I'm in a financial position where I really can't pay this. And if you look on the website, they will often give you a path to appealing the application fee. It doesn't always work, but looking for that, emailing the department administrative assistant can go a long way to getting some of that money back. And then the last thing on money I'll say is that if you're at a position of you've put in applications, you've gotten a few admittances, you can actually start to ask detailed questions about, okay, there's funding for how many years, how much insurance, is there guaranteed funding past this point? Just because you really want to have a good sense of what you're signing up for. For literature PhDs, there are sort of similar job options to professional writing and creative writing in reality. I know a couple people who went into business consulting. I know a couple people who went into technical writing for, say, financial firms. And a couple of people who went into things like publishing or communications. So basically, you are learning to read, speak, and think. And there are places that value that. So often these are jobs that you could get with an undergraduate English degree, but you'd be moving in at a slightly higher level with a PhD. So PhD is aimed at getting you an academic job, but it's not the only thing you can do with it, and it's not the only thing that makes it worthwhile.
Awesome.
I would just really quickly second Dr. Soderberg, about the transparency in like funding. I don't know if it's this way anymore, but University of Iowa MFA program was notorious for the funding not being equitable, and some people got more than others, and it just created just like it is almost as if they like enjoyed there being some tension in the workshop for competition and things like that. And I hope it's not that way anymore, but that's, transparency is good, and don't ever be afraid to ask questions when it comes to that sort of stuff. Also, if you are lucky enough to get accepted in a couple places, you might have a little leverage. It worked out for me that way at Nebraska. I was pretty well set to go to University of Tennessee's PhD program, and Nebraska gave me more money to go there. So it was just, it wasn't, I think it's delicate, but you do have a little bit of leverage if you get accepted in more than one program. So.
Yeah, I think that happened with my husband did his PhD in creative writing, and he got accepted to more than one place, and when they heard that, they offered him more money to come to UGA. I would also say, so if you have multiple acceptances and you want someone to talk through it, we are all, I'm sure, happy to talk to you about it. And we're also very open to working with you on your application. So to move into that, because applying is like kind of arduous. It's sometimes you're like, I feel like if I can successfully get this application together, you should just let me in. So a lot of just a heads up, if you're thinking about this, a lot of the applications are due in the fall, or due first of the year, something like that. So you probably will be working on them in the fall. And the main elements are probably pretty much similar across the board. For an MFA, the most important element is your writing sample, which is somewhere in between 10 and 20 pages usually. For both genres. You also need a statement of purpose, which I'll talk about in more detail here in a second, and letters of recommendation. So that alone, I mean, nothing, you should probably do nothing at the last minute all at once, like to apply on a whim, but you would definitely need to plan for your letters of recommendation. And if you know you're going to apply to grad school and you're graduating and you aren't going to be around, you should let your people that are familiar with your writing know, and so that they can kind of prepare to write you a letter. And I think most programs are getting rid of this requirement. You also might need to take the GRE. And that's just so if you're looking at getting a teaching assistantship, sometimes you need that in order just to be accepted into the graduate program to be allowed to teach. Just so you know, I did great on the English section of my GRE, and basically could have maybe just been like guessing on the math section. And so I can tell you from my experience that score is not necessarily doesn't keep you from getting in. And I think a lot of schools now are not requiring it, but that's another thing that you would need to plan ahead and to look and see what is required for each program. The thing, though, that is going to make or break your application is definitely your writing sample. And there are a lot of things that go into that. It's not necessarily, I remember when I was applying to MFA programs, I was like, this is a referendum on whether or not I'm a good writer. My soul is at stake. This is very stressful. If you start feeling that way, like, it's normal. But there's a lot of things that go into that decision. I think sometimes professors are looking to create a certain kind of group of writers with different skills or different perspectives or different talents, because a lot of the grad school experience is learning from each other. It's not just learning from your teachers. So in a workshop, the feedback that you get from your peers is extremely important, and sometimes more important than what you get from your professor. So So I think it's important to know that going in, but that's the kind of most important aspect of your MFA application. The statement of purpose is, though, it's like a terrible genre because you don't know what it's supposed to be, I think, and so many programs don't give you any guidance. Sometimes they'll tell you, and sometimes they won't, and the page length or word count length is sort of variable, so then you have to manage that. But the advice that I got, which I think is useful, is that your statement of purpose should tell the reader where you've been, where you're going, and how this program is going to get you there. So what's gone into your education? What do you care about? Who are you? How do you think about yourself as an author? What do you want to do with your writing? And then what role is that program going to play? And I have found just a few resources. I'll put a link here in the chat when I'm done talking, because I can't do that and talk at the same time. But there are some resources online that you can find that will give you some guidance about what a statement of purpose is, some examples you can find, and I have found a few that I think are good. But it's another thing, please, if you're applying, please check in with us. Let us see your draft, give you some advice, because it's a really kind of tricky thing, and it's a kind of high stakes, 750 words you're writing. So it's very useful to have someone look at it with you as you go. Casey, am I forgetting anything?
No, I would just add that I mean, I would second everything Rosalie said, and I would just add that it's a genre that doesn't come natural to most academics, whether we're talking creative writing or otherwise, like talking about yourself. And it's so important to get us to have some of us read it, regardless of the genre, or it doesn't have to be us. You've got other professors. I mean, whoever you feel like would be a good person to read it, because students, people who haven't experienced this don't realize what some of the tropes and cliches might be. Everybody who applies for an MFA, kind of has the same sort of origin story, right? Or even if their origin story is different, there's these kind of touchstone points that the people reading these applications have heard 1,000 times. Ever since I was little, I loved reading books. So did all of us, right? And maybe if you didn't, maybe that's a way to kind of come at this, maybe coming at it later or whatever. But there's kind of things that have just been done over and over and over again. So it's about why do I want to work there, and what does this program have to offer? I think it's really, really smart, and this is for any program. To be really specific about the classes that you want to take and what you think those classes will do. If there's any faculty you want to work with, if there's other opportunities at that university, a reading series or research work, or, on Nebraska had the Center for Walt Whitman Studies or something, and they had some other stuff that's really, really valuable, important things. So if there's something there that is drawing you to the program, do your research and explain exactly what you want to do there. I'll just say now, you got to be a little bit careful about who you want to work with. That can be a bit of a minefield, but I think you should do your research about who the faculty are and what they might offer, and what you're really interested in, because everybody's writing, I want to come to this school because it's great. Well, why? Specifically, what about this school? What about what we have to offer? Because at least in the MFA and PhD in creative writing anyway, it's the faculty are only picking people they want to spend a lot of time with, because you're going to be there 3 years or 5 or 6 years for the PhD, and it's they want to work with you, right? And that's what they're looking for. So you may have a great sample, but they're I can't help you as a writer. You're doing something different than what I think I can do as a faculty member. So they go with somebody else, right? So it's about, so what Rosalie was saying too about it being a referendum on your abilities as a writer, it's not. Lots of people apply to grad school and don't get in, only to get in later. So it's not, it's not like a one shot thing.
I thought I would talk a little bit about record keeping, because we're talking about writing a statement of purpose where you have to say, who am I? And I know for a lot of us, when someone asks what our interests are, we kind of blank. So I recommend that you start keeping a list, just a master document of the things you do, extracurricular activities, the courses you've taken, jobs that you've had, because this will become important later on down the line when you're applying for jobs, filling out a CV, going through a tenure review if you do get a tenure track job. So start now, like keeping track of the things that you do, where you've done them, like if you've presented at conferences, what years that you were president of the literary magazine, so you don't have to keep them in your head all the time, but you have that document in front of you for when you are wanting to write your applications. And another record keeping thing is to maybe keep an Excel spreadsheet or a chart of all of the schools you are applying to. And that is kind of like a progress report, so you can see the progress you're making, but and this is kind of similar in the literary or the academic publishing field as well. Sometimes they'll give a date that they will get back to you by. So if you want to note that, and if so you aren't left wondering, will they ever get back to me? So as long as you have some kind of master list to track your progress, I think that'll keep you focused, and that this is a task, this is a job, and not just, I'll send it off into the universe and see whatever happens. So hopefully it keeps you driven during this process.
Kristen or Laura or both?
No, please.
You, no, go, please go.
Sorry,
All right,
this is
we
my
won't prolong it
mismanagement.
too long. All right, so I was going to say that one of my memories from grad school applications was always having the sense that I was desperately doomed and behind, because if you look up timelines for applying to graduate school, they will often start far, far earlier than I think most people actually start application materials. So it's not so uncommon to see those kinds of things say, all right, if you're going to do this, you really need to start at the beginning of the summer so you can use your summer to take the GRE, the fall to get letters and materials together, and then submit things at the end of the fall, sort of that some December 1st deadlines tend to be the earliest. I found that incredibly terrifying. So I want to put in a plug for, if you are feeling like you are already behind, do not worry, you are not. The worst case scenario is you wait a year to go to grad school, and then you are going into graduate school a better prepared human being, and that's all a good thing. But also to say, these application materials are a little bit scary and opaque because they are so strange. A statement of purpose is close to a cover letter, but it's not. And you do want to have one of us look at it because it's sort of niche. But as much work goes into these application materials, know that it's totally doable. Statement of purpose, usually about 2 pages. Writing samples, more work, it's probably about 10 to 15. You can do this. So just don't be frightened by, if you've Googled online, if you've Googled and found tips that are more terrifying than helpful, just know they're talking about a sort of ideal person who I think maybe doesn't fully exist. So yeah, I will say also for statements of purpose, it can be helpful to create a sort of skeleton document that says, here's who I am, here's the work I'm going to do and how I'm qualified to do it. And then leave open the space that you'll fill in for each program that says, and here's how I'll do it at X, here's how I'll do it at Y, so that you're not thinking about reinventing the wheel every time you come across a different program. As long as you're being careful to make sure you're submitting the right materials to the right program, it can be a little bit more efficient.
Yeah. I think I use the same sort of phrase in all of my statements, which is like, these poets at your program are doing fill in the blank really in a way that I admire, and I would look forward to working with them, and just like sort of template style.
I would just add one thing. Laura mentioned that made me think of this. You don't get bonus points for turning your application in before the deadline. Nobody is waiting. Like, these faculty have this like stack of applications, or they're all digital now, but they've got this digital stack of applications. If applications are due December 15th, they're not starting to read them December 16th. I guarantee you they're not. And they didn't read any that came in on September 1st. Like, they're just not happening. So, if they're due the 15th and you turn them in on the 15th, that's all that matters. Like, there's no they're not ranking them, because just being on this end of things, I've never read PhD or grad school. I read some grad school applications, never PhD applications or anything, but it's like, if we had a stack of 50 of them, we wouldn't start reading them until our break, probably. Right. So it's just, you just meet the deadlines, but don't feel like if you know, that getting it in early would have been some kind of special thing. It's not. So just get it in.
Kristen, you have anything to add?
I was just going to say, it's important to make sure that you're building relationships with your professors. I think it can be so easy to kind of like, you know, I don't know, like English majors tend to be like introverted and quiet. We kind of do our own thing a lot of the times. And I'm saying this from experience because this was absolutely like what I did. But yeah, just making sure that you are like, your professors are familiar with what you're interested in and your work and your writing, because you want them to be able to write good letters of recommendation for you. And I remember, so like I only spent 2 semesters as an English major, and then I was asking them to write me recommendation letters, and some of them I only had just had in one class and didn't really know them outside of that. And I remember having to meet with them and kind of go over this document of like, this is what I've done and what I'm interested in, and kind of filling them in on that. And that feels way less organic than just if you have those like kind of naturally formed relationships with your professors over the years as an undergraduate. So if at all possible, you know, just like make time to go to events and get involved and join, you know, the Student Writers Union, or, you know, there's a plug for the Student Writers Union, which Professor Moffat and I advise. You know, these kinds of things are going to help your professors get to know you and be able to write you the best letters of recommendation they can, which is only going to help you as you fill out these applications.
And we got some questions. Just to a question from Jade: is it pretty typical to apply to many different PhD programs? Did you give yourselves more options beyond the programs you're mainly interested in? Between Dr. Pitcher and Soderbergh and I, yes, I think because it's hard to tell where you'll be accepted. Like there's no place where you're like, I'm an in there, like a safety, you know. So I think that for me, I applied to a bunch, and I think Casey, your advice is apply to as many as you can afford to. So I think, yeah, I think that, and again, like you're probably not applying straight to PhD programs from undergrad. You're probably going to either do a master's PhD program or an MFA, or just a master's. So that's something I think I also didn't know as an undergrad, oddly.
When I say apply to as many as you can afford, I mean, with some caveats. I mean, they tend to be kind of expensive to apply to, but I think the 8 to 10 to 12 range is perfectly acceptable if you can afford that. If you can't, then apply to as many as you can afford to. You want to be able to, like, you know, don't apply places that you don't want to go, or you don't, or in a city that you don't want to live in, or a town that you don't want to live in. I mean, like, so, you know, maybe you're independently wealthy and you can apply to, you know, 50 programs. I don't know if that's quite what I would do, but I think applying to places that you really want to get into, and if it's in that 10 to 12 range or 8 to 10 or whatever, I think, you know, I think that's, it seems like that's where most of us probably were when we applied to grad school, somewhere in that range.
Yeah. And we have a few minutes. So, and maybe we can, I know some people might have to go, but what other kind of questions do you have about grad school, about applications?
Sorry. What do you think the best ways to go about like who do you think the best professors to ask for letters of recommendation are for? Like, sorry, who do you think the best professors are to ask for letters of recommendation? Like, I'm not saying like individual people, but like, how do I tell? I'm not good at reading people. I'm on the spectrum.
Well,
I'd say the faculty members that you have feel like know your work the best, regardless of what that work is, and the ones you maybe feel like you have a relationship of some kind with. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of part of our job. I mean, I sort of see it as part of the job. So the only people that I wouldn't ask are people that you feel like, you know, you didn't have a relationship with, or didn't take a class with, or something like that.
Okay. And then in regards to writing samples, do they have to be strictly written, or what about like video essays or stuff like that?
That's a really interesting question. I think there might be some programs now that are like sort of hybrid that offer, you know, I know that there are some that offer multi-genre writing degrees. Probably because one thing you'll find as you start applying to grad schools is that their websites are terrible. And so I don't think that there are maybe that many programs that have the sort of like infrastructure set up to accept multiple kinds of files. But if that's what you're interested in, and there's a program that seems like it, you know, would suit you, like, oh, you can take classes in other art forms, like at Purdue, you could, I think required to take a class in like a different kind of art form just to like expand your experiences. So a quick email to the AA, would you accept this? How would I submit it? Is a great way to find out.
Okay, cool, thanks.
And Jaden wants to know if we can talk more about fellowships. Do you mean fellowships, Jaden, in the grad program or afterwards? Oh, in the grad program. Okay. So someone else want to jump in here? I was trying to think about.
I had a fellow, so they were just called assistantships in, I think the difference, I guess, for me is always the assistantship has teaching attached to it. The fellowship sometimes doesn't. But then in my PhD, I think it's just kind of another word. Every school uses it a little bit differently. Generally, fellowships, though, struck me as like more competitive, more money, they might be coming from a different pool of money. Like in Nebraska, there was like a, you know, presidential fellowship and then a provost scholar, you know, they had like different levels and each one was slightly more money or slightly less money. So I think sometimes it's coming out of a different, maybe it might not be coming out of like the departmental funds, but usually they're just part of the application, either when you apply or once you're there, you can apply, and it's kind of like a, you know, kind of almost like a contest for you to enter into. At least that's what it was for us.
Yeah, I think that the word fellowship is sometimes used when it doesn't have a responsibility. So I know for some PH at UGA, like for the fancier people that they accepted, that they were like trying to lure from other programs, you know, they'll be like, okay, so you can have a fellowship your first year where you're funded, you get your tuition remission, you get your stipend, but you don't have to teach. Whereas the majority of people who are accepted do have to teach that first year. So and regarding the teaching assistantships as well, I mean, it's not like they're like, you're in, step into the classroom, like you're, you know, like you get some training in pedagogy at Purdue. You started, I think it was like a couple weeks earlier, and then we had this ongoing class on how to teach and some guidance. So if that's something too that you're like, wait, what? They just like, I'm just gonna start teaching. You, as part of that sort of responsibility, I think most programs give you some pedagogy training on how to set up your classroom, what to assign, how to grade, etc.
And I'll just throw in that when you're applying to a graduate program, most often, if there's an internal fellowship, it's not something you have to apply for separately. There are a few external fellowship, like nationally funded fellowships floating around out there. But in general, if a program wants you in their program and they're going to try and toss money to get you there, they will find a fellowship and tell you about it. So if you're on the outside looking in, don't feel like it's your responsibility to do research for scholarships in the way that you do for undergrad. It's frankly a little bit more smoke and mirrors than it is for undergrad even.
I had one little, this is maybe a little bit of advice that won't apply exactly, but to now, but I think it's worth sharing. My very first, my MA program, we had like 3 days of training. We didn't have that much time. It was sort of like, here's 3 days, you're now a comp teacher. There was scaffolding built in throughout the semester, true, but it was very much a kind of sink or swim. And I was super nervous, and I was coming in from the parking garage, and this like full professor, old guy that I'd had for a class, he asked how I was doing. I was like, oh, I'm kind of nervous about this, and he said, there's one thing to remember. Like, no one will remember if you're a bad TA, a teaching assistant. They will remember if you're a bad scholar or a bad writer or a bad student. Now, he meant, obviously, of course, meet your requirements. Don't be irresponsible, like none of those things, but like, do what you need to do as a teacher, but remember why you're there, right? If you're there in an MFA, you're there to write. They will get way more out of you in the future as you in a writing career. They're gonna be like, oh, remember Casey, he was a terrible Comp 1 teacher that one semester. Like, you're there to write. And if you're there in a PhD program, you're there to do scholarship and research. That's what you're there for. So, if you get an assistantship, learn from it. You're getting lots of great skills. All of that's wonderful, but remember why you're there, right? You're there to work on either your craft as a writer or to work on your scholarship and your development as a scholar and a thinker and a writer too. So, like, it's stressful, it's scary, but keep your eye on what you're there for. And I still think about that piece of advice. It's like, no, it's about your priorities, about what you're doing. Okay.
Yeah, and if that means, like, if you're like, I don't know if I can do a PhD program, they're just gonna make me teach, that's scary. Like, you'll be fine. You'll totally be fine. If I did it, if I could do it, you absolutely can do it. How important are grades and GPA? That is a great question. My first answer is, I know that there are a lot of people in MFA programs who have really bad grades. I think we had even someone in my cohort that was like, I have a felony, like, so there's not, it's not really important, but some, because of this graduate assistantship or teaching assistantship, sometimes you have to meet a certain threshold just to be accepted into the graduate school at all. Whereas maybe the writers at that school would be like, no, we want this person, but they did, like, they don't quite meet the threshold to get into the graduate school at all. So that's the only thing that I know is, like, sometimes you have to, there's a minimum for that, that you might look at. Other people know about this?
For me, my experience with MFA is, if you can write and they want you there, they'll find a way to get you there.
I think it might also be a factor for letters, in that you want to be confident that you have enough faculty who can speak to you as a strong student, or at least someone who has it together enough to get through a program well.
Mm-hmm.
And, not to say, so you got a D in a couple classes, that's one thing. If you got a D in the class that your letter writer had you in, that might be a little bit trickier.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to make sure that you have some people who can speak to your skill set, even if, maybe you were more exploratory and took some classes you weren't great at. That's fine and totally normal. They won't care about that much in applications, but you do want letter writers who can say, no, this is a strong candidate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because again, like, they're working with you closely, and a cohort is like 4 people. Like at Purdue, they let in 4 poets and 4 fiction writers every year. So if you're not, like, functional, that's bad, right? So yeah, being worried about, like, say you're really bad at math, fictionally speaking, like, and you got a bad grade in math classes, like, that's not gonna preclude you from applying or getting in. But if your creative writing teachers are like, they never came, they never turned in their stuff, then that's a bad sign for this particular. Other questions? It's 1:05. Maybe we'll just take one more burning questions before we close out. Anything? Cool. All right, guys. Thanks for coming. If you have any questions, obviously we are your teachers, so you can ask us as you think of them. And have a lovely, lovely afternoon.